I think one of the things that I have reflected a bit about is when you look back to EMIR, there were really no guidelines. With SFTR and with MiFIR, there's guidelines. I don't think we have seen guidelines for SFTR.
We have.
Yeah, and then, but there has been industry groups. And the question is if these industry groups, in your opinion, is something that has contributed to a better understanding of the regulation we face. I don't know, Mikkel,
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, I think one of the good things about SFTR, when you look at SFTR as a whole, is certainly as a community, I think there's a lot of lessons learned maybe from EMIR as well, and they came in. The communities work very, very closely together, whether it's the working groups from ISLA, EMIR, when you look at the SFTR ISO working group as well, which is around building the standards. I think as a community, it's been working very, very closely, and to be fair to ESMA, with ESMA, in terms of what practically the regulation means and how it can be applied. I think the challenge that you have, as with all of these things, is as the regulation is now coming to fruition, and a lot of the Q&As and responses, they came through quite late at the end of the day, at the end of last year. You look at the schema, the final schema was only confirmed at the end of December. Validation was 6th of January. So there's been a lot to process, and a lot of things are happening quite close to the first wave live day. And the challenge is, there are still a lot of questions that are open and outstanding. So I think there's been a lot of collaboration, I think there's been a lot of discussion, and I think that's really, really helped. I think the challenge is there's still a lot of questions that are going to be out there. Hence, I think we'll all be back in a year's time talking about SFTR refit, 2.0, etc. Unfortunately.
And also, there are still open issues from EMIR that hasn't been solved yet. I think what we will see is that those will be transferred also to SFTR.
But I think the one thing with industry groups and SFTR that everybody who is building something around SFTR has been building to assumption. And industry groups with the best practices has helped forming that assumption being somewhat in the ballpark what the actual final guidance will be. So it's been a continuous work, and I know that there's been some heavy lobbying and discussions with ESMA as well, but it has been quite good for the market building the reporting solutions to actually follow that over that time that has been the last 2 years more or less.
I was just going to add that, so I think there's been somewhat unprecedented level of market engagement in this regulation. So we've been involved through the trade associations, particularly the likes of the ICMA, literally since 2012, when the European Commission first started to discuss the issues coming out of the financial crisis in relation to shadow banking. We were then very engaged with the Financial Stability Board formed by the G20 in order to set a global framework for these reporting requirements. And so we were involved in the publication of that paper in 2015. And then it's very much followed through with the discussions with the European Central Bank and the European System of Central Banks around their data store project on how they're going to aggregate this data and essentially share the European data with the FSB, and then the conversations with ESMA. In terms of the regulatory technical standards, the implementation technical standards, they have been enormously more prescriptive than anything we've seen historically for MiFIR, MiFIR, or for EMIR reporting, or any other regime. However, I suppose one of the key challenges here is that this is a much more ambitious and much larger piece of regulation than anything that it follows, such that irrespective of the fact that we've got literally hundreds of pages of guidelines now, albeit published very late on the 6th of January this year, we've got extensive consultations, we've got very detailed regulatory technical standards and implementation technical standards, and then the level 1 that was also published by the end of 2015. So there's a lot of material out there. However, as you quite rightly point out, there's still quite a lot of room for interpretation in a number of areas, and that's really sort of the most dangerous sort of component of the implementation. And then you've got kind of real curveballs coming out of the guidelines published on the 6th of January, particularly in areas like settlement finality. So certainly from a repo industry perspective, there was a general and widely held view that we were looking at perfect settlement. We were not planning to make any reporting adjustment in relation to transactions that were failing on the off leg. So in terms of when the maturity date or end date comes about, you were just assuming that that trade was settling, irrespective of whether it actually settled or not, and you needed to make any subsequent interest payments. And many of the world's biggest banks have built systems, and certainly by the 6th of January, quite detailed levels of testing, only to discover that they simply were not able to meet this requirement. That actually, if your transaction is failing on the maturity date or end date, or you've booked an early termination, then you're expected to suppress that early termination if the trade doesn't actually settle, or alternatively, you're expected to modify the transaction to reflect the change in the end date, to essentially roll that maturity date or end date forward to the next business day, or when you know it's likely to settle, and also make the corresponding changes to the cash on the transaction, etc. So they basically said we cannot comply with this element of the guidelines. It's far too late in the day. So they're going to their national competent authorities and saying, look, we need a deferral for this aspect of the regulation because we simply can't meet that date. So yes, in some ways, it's been the guidelines, the technical standards have been very extensive, but because you have up to 155 fields across 4 reporting tables, 10 action types, etc., yeah, there's still far too much for the industry to grapple and get everything right, for the 14th of April.
But it's still not right for EMIR either. So I think we should get the app and try to vote on the first question so that we get a sense of where you are in terms of SFTR, both in terms of the reporting model that we'll start off, and then in terms of where you are with the readiness. But we'll start with the first question, which is actually what kind of operating model are you looking at for SFTR?
Yeah, I'll just clarify to find Paul. Just go into agenda, click into the GTR session, and you find the questions.
Tense, isn't it? Like it's like the Eurovision Song Contest.
We're in the wrong conference.
But if this is difficult, then think of the regulation. Did you succeed? Okay.
That's interesting.
It is actually. But I'm pleased to see that the delegated reporting is something that is not the majority. I think we'll come into that later today, but I think one of the lessons learned that we see from when we speak to clients and prospects and other market participants is that those that have delegated is still believing that they are compliant to a full extent and they're not really having the adequate measurements into the reporting, even though they have delegated. I know that you have the same.
No, absolutely. I think probably the biggest point around delegation for me is that of the sort of bigger buy-side clients that we've spoken to, they've actually polled their broker-dealers and established that in many cases, certainly a large minority, if not the majority of them, have absolutely no plans to offer delegated reporting at all. So they're basically saying either they've got to migrate all of their activities to those broker-dealers that offer delegated reporting, or alternatively, they've got, and accept a large decline in the liquidity that they can receive. Alternatively, they've got to identify alternative solutions. So, yeah.
Should we try the next one? And that is actually, where are you in terms of readiness?
Needs some sort of background commentary, doesn't it, if the votes are coming in? I don't know if they can do that from the back, can they?
Nick, you want to background commentary?
So do we have a result?
There we go.
Okay. Okay. It's a bit depressing. Honestly. So I know that the buy-side deadline is in October, and I'm really thrilled that you all acknowledge that it will happen, and that the majority has done the impact analysis, because as Jonathan mentioned, this is quite a number of data that needs to be consolidated, and that is often what we see as well when we are assisting our clients, that data is not placed in one application, and you actually need a lot of integrations in order to get it working. And yeah, you just take biotech because
So
yeah, you from being a trade repository, you don't really see the challenges that is inside the, or do you see
no,
challenges?
I mean, it's strange because in a way you could say that's surprising, but it's not. One of the reasons I say that is DTCC actually, they made an announcement last week where and they quoted that they've opened up 138 accounts for SFTR for participants. Now, the Regis side saying they made the announcement, we were tracking about the same level. So if you think that probably means there's somewhere between 300 and 400 accounts have been opened today, what that tells you is that participants are either looking to delegate and have not open accounts themselves, so have no oversight responsibility for what they're actually being reported on their behalf, or actually they're not ready yet. So they're at an early stage of that process, and that really, I'm not surprised by that. And even us as a TR, you'd be surprised by the amount of questions that we're seeing increasing at the moment, just with regards to interpreting the legislation, looking at training, how we can support with training. So I get that sense that, I mean, as a community, it's great if you're a tier 1 bank. If you're a tier 1 bank, you can put a project team together and you can dedicate resources around SFTR. But I think for everyone else, it's trying to manage this project with all of the other priorities. It's a challenge. And I think what you've seen now, you've seen that momentum increase.
But I think going back to that, I don't think it's possible. It is possible, of course, but that's going back to the collaboration. That doing this by yourself, not being part of industry group, not being part of the community, it's really inventing the wheel for the third time. So you have to do it with EMIR, you do it with MiFIR, and now you're doing it with SFTR. I think that what we're seeing is that firms are taking a step back and saying, okay, we might look into the real use of data, the consolidation, and also, but I'm really glad that there's no. But if we move along and discuss, because we see time is flying when we're having fun here, then if we discuss the litigation topic and also addressing the data quality, because I know that ESMA, they have launched a data quality action plan, and among the that's for MiFIR 2, and among the I know that MiFIR 2 is not the core competence, but I think that instill that there are some reflections, also going back to EMIR and litigation, is that what we see is a maturity with the regulator, that we're now 2 years into MiFIR 2, and what the quality project is all about is about the rejected transaction not being correct. It's about the use of Concat, which is actually a data management that you don't have the ID of the person who is either the trader or the portfolio manager. It's a wrong trading venue, so that is the old one with the mid codes, the lay, the TV tick, timestamps, and price. So it's some of the same things that we have seen for EMIR as well, but now ESMA is launching the.
First of all, it's very different depending on which NCA, under which NCA's jurisdiction you are. So we have the Irish NCA and the British NCA that are very, and the Dutch as well, and some others that are quite well equipped to target these questions. On the other hand, we have some of the Southern European NCAs and even the Nordic NCAs that are just now hiring people to look over EMIR and the quality. So I think in the Danish NCA, they hired the first regulator around looking into data quality under EMIR last year. There's one person for the whole Denmark. So it's very different depending on where in Europe you are and what you're looking at, but it's clear that they are, the more active ones, they're looking at errors and omissions, for example. They cannot see why firms are not filing the errors and omissions reports on the MiFID, because the NCA see that we should have quite a lot of these coming in because we know the data is wrong, but the firms just aren't submitting their errors. So and that has to do with reconciliation. Also, the FCA has stated that they don't see the number of accounts being able to actually pull the data from the NCA, because that's the reconciliation method. You should pull the data from the NCA and reconcile with your journal books. But there are just not enough firms in the market doing that. And they're just looking at statistics from how many MiFID firms do we have and how many have these accounts. And it's just a very big difference in those numbers. So I think from that point of view, that the regulator has identified that they have to do something, and that's why they're really strict about these topics.
I'd certainly think that there's currently quite a big clamour going on for market share across the European Union, particularly with Brexit now essentially a done deal and the UK leaving, such that many of the NCAs are kind of looking to prove that they've got teeth, and therefore they're able to start identifying issues with their the parties that are required to report to them. And in many cases, these activities are kind of being onshored, having historically been conducted out of London. So I think there's quite a bit of activity there. And then in practice, certainly our findings suggest there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. So to start identifying issues with the reporting of firms, whether they're significant major firms or smaller firms, isn't actually that difficult. To get to the bottom of every issue that they're experiencing is more challenging, but when you can see, say, two-sided reporting in which one party is consistently submitting reports and there's no sign or evidence that the other party is submitting anything, that's quite a big red flag. Then, where there are fields that are not expected to be populated in relation to particular transaction types, they may still pass the validation rules, but again, you can prove consistently and quite easily that is an incorrect report, such that there's quite a lot of opportunity to essentially pick off some of the very lowest quality reporters in the early days and essentially prove that you are maintaining adequate controls over the functioning of your market. So I think there's quite a bit of movement in that space.
Being a TR, what reconciliation rates are you seeing?
Completely unfair question. I'll throw it out there at the beginning. I think that the key is for us to see. So when it first went live, reconciliation rates were extremely low, and that was why the market got used to it. What you've actually seen as we've gone along, sort of matching pairing internally amongst the TRs, that's improved dramatically. And the rates are extremely high. And actually, the inter-TR reconciliation rates are still running pretty low, relatively speaking.
And what is that?
In terms of the actual stats, I don't know the numbers now, but I think we started out and we were single digits. I think we're now running it's probably 20% mark around that. And that might be being optimistic, if I'm being completely honest. And what artificially I say artificially, what you tend to find is when there's delegated reporting, I'm stripping that out and I'm giving these numbers. If you include delegated reporting, obviously everything matches, and it's great.
I guess it depends on who's doing the delegation, if it's the counterparty or if it's the investment manager.
Very, very true. Yeah, but when it's the counterparty, and if you look at the flows there and I strip that out, it's still very low. Obviously with delegated reporting, it changes the stats dramatically. And I think that's, for us, in discussions I've had with a number of the NCAs, is that for them is a key issue, and it's a key area that they're looking to address. They're now receiving enhanced reporting from the TRs, And then now deep diving into the quality of the data that's being reported by counterparties.
Go into SFTR now here in April.
So I think it's very valuable for firms to kick off with some comprehensive and detailed training around how to report. If you've got a projects team that perhaps hasn't had any previous experience or familiarity with securities financing markets, then this may need to start with the very basics. Because if you don't understand instruments, it's quite difficult to interpret how you should populate the fields. So you need to understand what repos are, how they work, what securities lending and borrowing transactions are, how they work, and the same for buy-sell back, sell buybacks, and margin lending. And establish very fully and comprehensively across your firm what exactly your scope is. But as I say, the training will very much put you on the right tracks in terms of what you should be looking for, what questions you should be asking, and how you should interpret the different field requirements, the different action types, and establish what you're on the hook for reporting, or even providing to a delegated party to report on your behalf, and therefore what you should be looking to implement and how you should go about implementing it. There's a tremendous amount of information published by the trade associations, which again you should put to great use, particularly the ICMA. They've published extensive guidelines documents, lots of sample reports, and lots of action types and details of how you should populate and respond to those respective actions. This is all freely available, there's no paywall, so you can readily access all of that, and that's certainly very valuable. And then, say, to think about having some sort of third-party oversight, initially of your interpretation of the regulation and how you're carrying out your implementation, then to perhaps think about pre-testing such that you've got files that are in some stage of UAT, you can submit them to the trade repository in the correct ISO 20022 XML format, and then getting a third party to provide some perhaps accuracy testing of that file. Because if you can learn that you've got fundamental flaws in your process a month or two in advance of your go live, at least you either have the opportunity to correct those defects if you can, or at least you're aware of what they are and you can put an action plan together to close them out at a future date, and you can inform your national competent authority, yes, through sufficient due diligence, we've identified that we have some issues with our implementation, and we're giving you advance notice that we have an action plan in place to close this issue out, but our initial reports will suffer from the particular issue.
And from your side, Nick, is...
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things. I think the most important thing that we see going into the first wave, and if you use that, the lessons learned, and actually how ready is, wave 3, and we're not ready for October. We've already established in this that probably not as far along maybe as you'd like to be, is that you need to prepare now, you need to act now. So it's similar to exactly what Jonathan said, is I think when you're in wave 1, there's been such a short run up to live day that people are testing very late in the day. It's very hard to troubleshoot when you're looking at really only a matter of weeks. The sooner you start, for example, we mentioned the UAT test environments, with a TR like ourselves, it's to actually start engaging early, to actually ask questions, to start testing that UAT. That gives you time to develop and make any changes you need to, because there's no absolution. So you need to be reporting your trades. It's a bit like the question before, and actually I'm speaking to the converted anyway. I was surprised by some of the earlier results in terms of oversight and reconciliation, because ultimately participants can't delegate their responsibility to ensure that their trades are reported correctly. And this is exactly the same. Even if you have reconciliation issues to begin with, we all know that. As we've said, that they're not going to look at the results for the first 6 months. It's really going to be longer because of the phased approach. But get those trades in there, start testing as early as you can, because the support is there.
But what about capacity? Because if the market has not opened the accounts, they haven't selected the applications they're going to use, they haven't started the projects. So that means, where are the resources, and can they come? Can the entire market come in the last minute and open accounts?
Great question. What scares me, and I wasn't around back in when EMIR came out. And what by that I don't mean I wasn't born. I'll clarify that straight away. I know I look very young. I wish. But so I wasn't on the TR side. But the stats for EMIR and the reasons behind that was 80% of the accounts were opened up in the final 2 weeks before live day. Now, I'm not proposing that everyone waits till 2 weeks before and that we can manage those kind of volumes. But I think now we're well established. We can operate quickly. Most market participants, they're known and have accounts anyway, so we can open very, very quickly. But what you don't want is you don't want a big rush at the end. I think the best thing though, or the sensible thing about SFTR is that it's a staggered approach. And that means it's more manageable. And that's an advantage of it.
I was just going to quickly say, I think it's a difficult argument to sell, but if you're on the buy side and you've still got 7 months to run, then if you can train up people internally, it's not only a lot more efficient, but it's also a lot more effective in terms of getting those resources online to be able to implement it in the middle of October this year. But if you're expecting to sort of reach out to the street and pluck lots of SFTR experts, yes, clearly once the banks have implemented, there will be some availability of some resources, but they all know their value and their worth, right? I mean, ultimately, certainly until quite recently, you could count the number of experts on one hand, and I think you could probably still count the number of genuine experts on both hands, such that these people are few and far between. They can add a lot of value very quickly, but you're probably better off trying to train people internally.
I have to just agree with what you both are saying, especially around the industry groups and what has been the discussions there and participating in that. We still have seen some market participants and client and prospects trying to come up with creative solutions to get out of the regulation, to report the reporting models, to have them separate flows for different asset types and different vendors for different types of instruments and so on. And it's not trying to be creative with SFTR is probably going to be very hard when the reporting starts. So I think that going back to these industry groups, to the trainings, utilizing these experts that are in the market and getting as much knowledge as possible, as early as possible, and identifying those data gaps, which are the counterparties, what's in scope and so on. I think that's the biggest, what you should be focusing on right now.
But I think it goes back again to acknowledge that the regulation is there, it's not going away. The data requirements are there, it's not going to change. You have to get it right from the beginning. And even if it has to change your operating model. So that means that there's still a tactical approach, at least in this room, that's also very aligned with what I sense when I'm talking to our clients. And I think that there is an investment need, but it's also about justifying the investment getting to a situation that you described, where you see the regulation as a value add.
So I know that ISDA has been doing a lot of work on standard trade messages, and I think they've been focusing initially on sort of the FX derivatives market and trying to translate some of these concepts into SFTs and specifically repos. But I do think it is very early days. I think in terms of how the model works today, probably the biggest challenge is the fact that these are quite sort of siloed and quite specialist products. Unfortunately, whilst SFTs are very much sort of part of the fabric of the global capital markets and very much at the centre of the wholesale capital market, nonetheless, outside kind of money markets and repo and SFT circles, they're not sort of widely understood, such that to have a generalist looking at your reporting under SFTR or even under derivatives versus securities is quite a stretch at the moment. Until you've got far more standards adopted in terms of, well, this is a trade message that's actually quite generic and it's not dependent upon which type of transaction you're actually ultimately planning to report and use for other purposes, then yeah, it's certainly a stretch, I think.
I think personally, my opinion is that if you come to the place where you can reuse the data for several regulations, then there's also the benefit and there's the reduction of errors, and there's the scalability that isn't there. Because what we have seen is that when new regulations are coming along, they have a side effects on the existing regulations. And we used to have a model where we had single connectivity points, and each time there was a change in the connectivity point, we had to upgrade all the clients. We now moved to a solution where we have a multi-tenant, multi-regulation, meaning that we only have to update it once. So we have to, from our perspective, go into a model where we are managing the changes in a more efficient way, because we acknowledge that there is changes. And that also with data, I think that you have to go to a state where you don't have parallel processes you need to maintain and quality assurance.
There's also, when a new regulation comes along, so for example, SFTR is affecting MiFID with the central bank reporting, and it's also lining up for the ISO standard for EMIR as well. So we see that these consolidation fragmentations, not only with like data in, it's also in the data out, that these regulations are getting closer and closer with each other, and it's just a trend that we see that from ESMA side, from the regulators, they want to align this into one model. We're still far away from that.
Absolutely. I mean, you think there is common data, and exactly, and at the same time, you can SFTR using the ISO standard. Now that's a big step forward in terms of consistency in the messaging. Where you can see that moving to EMIR as well, and then that moves into things from TR perspective like portability, makes that easier. But for clients, it's so much easier if you've got common data to have a central golden source of record. That has to be the evolution, and you can use that data. I mean, it's absolutely what clients want from you.
Can I put a slightly different spin on it? So a couple of anecdotes from the early conversations with ESMA. In the early days, they were asking, we essentially, when it comes to collateral, we want you to tell us whether this is general collateral or special collateral. And special collateral implies that it has intrinsic value in the money markets, whereby if you use special collateral, you'll get loans at much lower interest rates, for instance. Now, we collectively as an industry turned around to ESMA and said, to be honest, it's a bit of a grey area. We couldn't tell you with any certainty what's general collateral and what's special collateral. However, you're going to be the recipients of the world's biggest database of repo rates, such that you can quite readily turn around to us and say, well, that's clearly special because it meets that cut-off, and this is clearly general collateral. So they actually moved away from asking for special collateral and just said, okay, give us general collateral and specific collateral. So they changed the definition. But they ultimately will be the best source of what special repo rates are per currency, because they'll be recipients of all of the data. Then when it came to thinking about haircuts, they were very concerned about how pro-cyclical SFT markets were. So they said, well, ultimately we want to set minimum haircuts. But in order to establish what haircuts are set across the street, because they're highly confidential, dealers will not tell each other what haircuts they're making on collateral, such that, again, ESMA is going to be the golden source of data in relation to what haircuts are being applied across every single firm, and then subsequently be able to make any determination as to, firstly, whether minimum haircuts are required, and what sort of level of those minimum haircuts should be set at. So clearly they will be recipients of lots of very much market information, but the same is true for firms. They'll have if they use this data properly, they'll have a much more thorough understanding of what their financing rates are, how different parts of their business operate in terms of where they're able to finance themselves. You know, is it more efficient to generate further returns using the repo market or the securities lending market, for example? You'll be able to tell this potentially for the first time. And generally to understand how you manage your collateral, how you address things like liquidity buffers, for instance. And generally, as I say, you can essentially have a lot of kind of market intelligence, which can be quite valuable. You can trade off it relative to the current state in which essentially there's been little or no reporting of this activity. activity at all, and firms have very often kind of struggled to really grapple and grasp what exactly they're doing in the SFT market.
Anyone else with a question?
I have a question about
Yeah.
the appetite of the brokers to offer data reporting. Certainly, and off the record conversation I had with one of our counterparties, intimated that come October, when the buy side comes in to SFTR, they fear the operational overload that will come from buy side poor quality reporting. And they're having to have arms of people to match and will handle of email traffic and things like this. Why wouldn't they offer delegated reporting in order just to maximise their matching rates?
Yeah, no, I'm happy just to pass on what I see from my side as a TR. And from Regis' point of view, we're joint ventures, so we're owned by Clearstream on one side, so Deutsche Börse Group, and Iberclear on the other. So we've got a number of sort of internal divisions that are facing the same sort of conundrum. And I think it's really down to the fact of it's market pressure. So from what we see, yes, there's a lot of complexity to it, a lot of development required. And I don't think there's a set rule that everyone's going to offer an all-in or all out. But I think really what we're seeing is if you don't offer it, it's going to disadvantage you in the marketplace. And what we're seeing is that everyone really is rolling out delegated reporting. And I think what they tend to be doing is when they're rolling out delegated reporting, they're really turning to data vendors to provide that solution. Because, as you said, the internal development, the cost of doing that's not their core business. They don't want to be doing it, but they're being forced down that road. You see it with securities lending as well, and the third-party lending agencies.
One of the biggest issues around delegated reporting was sort of tentatively removed in the guidelines that were published on the 6th of January, whereby essentially firms offering delegated reporting were no longer required to provide the reuse and cash reinvestment reports. They were still the responsibility of the reporting counterparty rather than the delegated party. So in some ways that kind of reduces the attractiveness of delegation because you've still got to produce and calculate this reuse yourselves. Having said that, it's a little bit like short selling for under MiFIR II in the sense that the last thing that parties want to do is so if you don't really want to reveal details of all of your positions across your entire book to your broker dealer in order for them to be able to perform the calculations in the report. And essentially it's the same deal for reuse reporting. So that piece has been taken out. Now, under the MiFIR II MiFIR implementation, essentially all of the banks initially stood firm and said, there's no way we're offering delegated reporting. We have so little confidence in the quality of our own reporting, we're certainly not going to take on the responsibility for anybody else's. And I certainly feel there's a lot of that out there at the moment. But then one of the big US houses stood up and said, yeah, okay, come to us, we'll deal in everything, and we'll provide all of your delegated reporting. So all of the other broker dealers essentially fell like a pack of cards and started offering some level of delegation. In practice, I would say it isn't really delegated reporting to the full extent in most cases. It's assisted reporting. So you will get access to your broker dealer's trade repository, whereby you'll be able to essentially see a mirror view of their transactions and then enrich the details with your own details and then submit the reports. So you will still maintain responsibility for submitting the reports, but you'll have quite a big leg up in terms of a vast majority of the fields in which you're required to report. And they should pair and they should match. So quite a lot of benefits from those sorts of services, and I think that's where all of the TRs are offering that sort of value add. But so fully delegated reporting, whereby you essentially sign off everything and nothing to see here, I think there's probably not much room for that. I suppose the biggest sort of challenge around this assisted reporting piece is, you still require quite a lot of effort to implement it. You've still got to set things up with each respective TR, and there's quite a high probability that you'll need to set up assisted reporting with multiple TRs. Because unless you want to see a significant reduction in the liquidity that you face, the chances are, yes, you'll need to sign up with these guys at Regis-TR, but you'll probably also need to sign up with DTCC, and you may need to sign up with Univista as well. So not only will you still have manual processes, but you're going to need to potentially apply those manual processes across up to three different assisted reporting solutions across the TRs. So, it definitely has pros and cons.
Thank you. I think we'll end by this, and I think there's lunch now.
Yeah.
Right, Nicklas? Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.